So 1994 was a seminal moment in our lives, and we kind of breathed a sigh of relief, turned a corner, and thought that apartheid nemesis was behind us. And I carried on with my life, doing various things to survive. But the archive came back to me in a way because the whole world became digital. And if you wanted any presence in terms of a picture library or picture sales, you had to have a digital archive. So I began digitizing my archive in the 2000s. But it was also like my story as well. And one needs to sort of understand this archive in terms of what we have gone through. So a lot of my photographs were not used. A lot of my photographs were off the beaten track. And there was a very strong imperative to find the stereotypical or the photographs that had currency during apartheid. So many of these photographs that I'd taken didn't really have much currency. They were sort of, kind of lost in the landscape, as it were. And so I have recently, in the last 10 years or so, digitized this part of my archive. And I'm also very conscious of the fact that the resistance movement to apartheid has, along with the whites' progressive left struggle, is not popular anymore. It's sort of become, for me, erased. It's a kind of an erased history. And as an archivist, I feel it's very, very important that this story, which is quite personal, is not lost historically, and that it becomes part of our understanding of the past as we navigate the future. So it's a very, very important personal story for me. And so shooting back is an amalgam of all these images taken over a period of 40 years to show what was happening at the time, that we were caught in a deeply militarized society that had an impact not just on South Africans but right throughout the frontline states. Millions of people suffered as a result, and I think people don't entirely acknowledge the impact that the South African military had on Namibia, on Angola, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and we need to bring it back and reflect, on this. And images allow one to view our history and understand our past and reframe in a modern context, in a present context. So that was that's for me the motivation in producing this body of work. So this family, I would call it, of and this very powerful movement of resisting apartheid by many, many thousands of South Africans is not forgotten and is not erased.
And I do think that your examination of that particular aspect and period during our history has tended to be blurred out of the dominant discourses, blurred out of the historical narratives that exist within contemporary South Africa that we live in. And it's interesting as a former conscript to reflect on those too and see those images, and I'm sure for many other white conscripts, but not necessarily just white conscripts, all of those who were militarized. And as you say, the extent of the SADF's influence in Greater Southern Africa was incredibly, had a massive impact on the histories of those countries too, and crossed the barriers of race, ideology, and history too. So I do think a document of this nature is interesting within a contemporary space. But also allied to that, I'd like to just get your reflections on the manner in which a militarized society plays into and epitomizes those celebrated hyper-masculinities that tend to evolve in those sorts of scenarios. And I do think there are elements of those masculinities or hyper-masculinities that tend to persist within contemporary South Africa. Do you, as a photojournalist and an archivist and a resistor, feel that those hyper-masculinities have crossed barriers of race? And do you think, there are two questions here really, do you think they still persist within contemporary South Africa?
Oh, definitely. The issue of hyper-masculinity not in South Africa but in the region has got to be, examined and looked at very, very closely. So while we grew up in this militarized state and were kind of induced into playing sport and being the dominant male and not being a sissy and all of those kind of things, which then kind of like follow on and lead in a kind of causal way to become part of the military and defend your country against these so-called terrorists and communists. There were other aspects that were also part of that, let's say, intellectual, social equation, which were demasculating the black and indigenous population. Groups of people who've come from proud traditions of being warriors, of being men of substance and of meaning, dehumanized, in the workplace, particularly on places like the mines and so on. And so I, with a broader lens, I also saw how these men, strong men, struggled and coped with their sense of identity and their sense of demasculization, if you like, and how that refracted in their lives. So it brought out another kind of militancy, a kind of revolutionary militancy that is part of the parlance of South African politics. It's a social militancy, whereas I'm an urban black man, in my own world, I count, I matter, I can express myself in particular ways. And some of it's positive and some of it is highly questionable, particularly in relation to how men treat women and all of those things. I mean, what I also did see in in other countries that I documented, like in Mozambique, was also, I was right inside some of those war zones, and I witnessed for myself, just how completely battered those communities were as a result of wars, and the role that men in uniform played on both sides, whether it was Frelimo or Renamo or UNITA or FNLA or the MPLA. So we've got scars and we've got wounds in the whole region, as a result of war, colonization, and imperialism. And so my work in shooting back, goes beyond just the South African border. It looks at the broader society and how masculinity and hyper-masculinity has impacted on our society.
Which leads me, I think, to a question that I suppose follows logically from your previous comment. And during the lockdown, the COVID-19 lockdown, and the government's extension of the powers of the SANDF and SAPS, did that prompt a feeling of dread or deja vu in you, considering the scenes that we saw play out within marginalized communities, informal settlements, etc., and of course the dichotomies that resulted in terms of the lockdown and where the army and the police were deployed to, because it became very obvious, of course, that those were deployments that were largely to those particular informal settlements or marginalized societies. And we didn't have Caspers rolling through the suburbs, so to speak. How did that impact on you, seeing those scenes play out on the news?
So when COVID-19, hit South Africa, and we joined the global pandemic, as it were, it unmasked and it also exposed the inabilities and already existing inefficiencies within government to cope with just a lot of day-to-day management of the country. And it was very depressing for me to see that the sort of fallback position was a military one. Cyril Ramaphosa in fatigues, addressing the nation, the war against COVID-19, the task, the national task team, task council, it was called the national, they spoke about the war room. So all these metaphors were again like bringing back dreaded memories of the apartheid past. And actually that's what happened. COVID-19 was kind of locked down, we locked down, and it was a militaristic approach to a social situation that required a much broader and smarter way to deal with it. And the South African government was, unmasked and exposed in this time. 73,000 troops, being deployed. I mean, I witnessed for myself because I drove food from Muizenberg into Vryheid, and I saw policemen chasing, people walking down the street, just like they would have done in the 1980s. Jumped out of their cars, beating people. They arrested, people who, had food kitchens for apparently not, upholding social distancing protocols. I mean, ridiculous ways in which they alienated and brutalized, marginal people. At the same time, the South African government didn't bring, food to the people in Vryheid, where I was. There's until this day not one government food parcel that has come to that community of 42,000, and it's only like NGOs and civil society and caring humans who responded, from a humanitarian point of view, to the point that they were feeding 300,000 people